Hey guys, it's 2022 and it has been far too long since we've done a complete 360 tour tutorial. I would like to show you the latest way to create a tour. We're going to do that right now. So you head into Unity and you install Complete 360 Tour. You get it off the asset store. Simple enough, and you're going to get some new folders in your project. Digital Salmon C360, and you might get Digital Salmon Core as well. In the Digital Salmon C360 folder, you have the example tour folder. That's the one you probably want to open first. And then if you navigate to the example tour.asset and either press enter or double click, you'll get the C360 window. Like any Unity window, you can dock it anywhere you like. Within it, you're going to see a bunch of example nodes. Now, we've set these up to try and demonstrate a few of the different things that C360 can do. The ones on the right are all image nodes, but the one on the left is a video node. Once you've opened up your tour, you'll be in the C360 window and you'll be able to navigate the node graph with the following controls. By clicking and holding the middle mouse button, you'll be able to pan the node graph. If you hold Control and use the left click, you'll be able to do the same thing. That's good for you Mac users. If you click and drag with the left mouse button, you'll be able to multi-select all the different nodes. Now, you don't get an inspector that's unique to all of them, but it can be quite useful for moving them all at once if you're trying to organize your graph in an interesting way. If you right click in the node graph at any point, you'll get a create menu that lets you add a image node or a video node. However, that is a slightly longer way of doing it, as C360 does support dragging and dropping of textures from your Unity project into C360 window, which will simply create, name, and assign the appropriate load data to your node. You can scroll using your mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And it is worth noting with the tour asset selected, you do have this option over here of graph background and graph background size and alpha. Some people like to lay their nodes out on a physically accurate map. It can help with your sort of planning and tracking. An example of that, if I put these smileys in, is available here. Obviously these smileys aren't what we'd be using, but I don't have a map available to me. Let's put that back down to 0 as I'm not using it. Going from top to bottom, you're going to see the name of the node. Now, that doesn't get used for anything once you're in for runtime, but obviously you could do it if you were coding some of your own things. The position of the node in the graph, and that can be edited either by modifying the values here or by physically moving it with the mouse. You can override the hotspot for that node. Now, that is the hotspot referring to the hotspot to enter that node, not the hotspots used to exit that node. So if, for example, the front door had a particular hotspot whenever you were traversing to it, for instance, a front door icon, you could tick the hotspot, override, give it a new game object, or give it a new icon. Within it, you can see the elements. Now, you wouldn't normally edit these manually in the inspector. What you'd normally do is use the graph view to edit them, and I'll show you that in a minute. You can see the entry yaw, that relates to the direction in which the camera will be facing when you enter that particular node. Whether or not the node is stereoscopic. In the case of this one up here, we have a stereoscopic node. If that was ticked off, you would see that the node came out wrong, but with it ticked on, it comes out correct. And we have two projections supported, which are VR180 and equirectangular, although that wouldn't be too difficult to add support for extra projections. And you could certainly hack it in just by editing the existing shaders if that suited you. We had a custom data. It's literally just a string. It's associated with a particular node. If you don't know why you might want that, then you're probably not somebody who needs it, but a few people requested it, so we added it. You have some timeline settings. Does this node loop? How long does this node last? And at what point should we preview in the timeline? Now, the preview MS doesn't make a huge amount of sense for images, but it's very useful for scrubbing video. And you will be able to use the timeline to actually scrub. You wouldn't need to edit it in the inspector. The concept of a duration and a loop on even an image node is that it can still be quite useful for people who want prefabs or hotspots to only appear for a certain period of time while working on a node. That could be interesting for doing sort of escape room type situations or other quite kind of bespoke tour use cases. Let's jump into node graph. At any point, you can drag with your right mouse button off a node. If you go up to the top, you're going to get the mapping panel. The mapping panel gives you the full preview of the node and allows you to move any hotspots you've already created. We'll get into hotspot creation in a minute. If you have the node selected and you're in the mapping panel, you can drag the entry yaw over in the inspector in order to move the sort of forward direction. And we've got a nice preview in here so you can see where that's going to be. There are multiple entry yaw types. There's one called absolute and one called dynamic. Absolute will always ensure that essentially that this line you see here is aligned to north. This is quite useful if you're doing kind of physically accurate tours in spaces where you'd like everyone to not have to turn around to look. They would have to turn around to look back the way they came, if that makes sense. Or dynamic, which ensures that when a user enters a node, no matter which way they were looking, they will be facing that line. probably more useful for something like a choose your own adventure. It's probably worth going through how to actually create your very own tour. The first thing you'd want to do is probably to have your own folder outside of all of C360's folders. So let's pretend our company was called Virtual Tours Are Us. And you would do create complete 360 tour, and you would say my first tour. Doesn't really matter what you name it, but if I press enter or I double click the tour, I will get a default tour. Now I'm getting this big gray box because I have no graph background assigned, but the graph alpha has defaulted to 1. I'm going to drag that down to 0 and it's going to be done. I'm going to pick the default hotspot from C360 as my go-to hotspot, and I'm actually ready to start adding media. Now I would probably create a folder and it would be images, and in there I would put all of my image content, but since I'm actually using the example tour as an example, I'll grab them out of the images folder. Now from here I can just drag in my media, place it wherever I want, probably something relatively spatially sound, so something like this is probably sensible, and in this case I'm just going to check, and indeed the stereo image needs to be marked as stereoscopic in order to work properly. The first thing I'm probably going to want to do is create a bunch of hotspots that link all the different pieces of media together. Now I'm going to start by doing that very slowly, but in reality it's actually an extremely quick process. I'm going to hold my right mouse button on front door. Bear in mind Mac users that control and click will essentially give you a right mouse button. I'm going to drag up to the top right, which is the add hotspot icon, and release. It's going to give me a little connector that's attached to my mouse, and if I hover over any of the nodes, it's going to snap to those nodes, indicating that it's happy to make a connection to them. I'm going to start with corridor, and when I click, it's going to give me a hotspot and say, where in this front door scene would you like to go and add a hotspot link to corridor, and I'm going to click up there. I've actually got these the wrong way around, but that's fine. They can just stay connected. I'm then going to go from corridor back to front door and click down the stairs. Corridor can go to, in fact, corridor can't go anywhere. It's actually the front door. The front door should be over here. Front door goes to living room via this door here. Living room goes to front door via the door over there. Living room goes to the kitchen via this here, and the kitchen goes back to the living room by that door. And you see, I did that very quickly. The first ones I did quite slowly, but you could see that you could put together an entire tour extremely quickly. And for testing's sake, I'm going to add a link to this stereoscopic image just at the end of that corridor, and a link back from the stereoscopic image at that door. It's a bit of a weird way to do it. You probably wouldn't do it in any of your real tours, but since we're just demoing the content, it's quite nice to do it. Now, I like to be quite fussy and sort of get everything snapped to a grid. So I'm just going to arrange it like that. It doesn't make any real difference where you place your nodes once it comes to runtime, although it is worth saying for people who are interested, all of the data that we create here, everything in this scriptable object, which includes everything you see in the inspector of all of the scriptable objects for not only nodes but also hotspots and mapped prefabs, that's all available to you at runtime. So while C360 offers a bunch of kind of default things you might need, a lot of people ask the question of, can C360 do this? Can it do that? One example being a sort of top-down map that lets you navigate to any node. The answer is, if it's not included out of the box, that probably doesn't mean it isn't possible. We support up to a certain amount of prefabs, the ones that we've kind of included as examples, but there's absolutely no reason to think that you wouldn't be able to make, for example, a top-down map if you had some Unity skills. If not, best bet, hire a Unity developer. It's probably not a particularly big job, and C360 makes it extremely easy. Once we've added our various hotspots that link to the different places, bear in mind you can select a hotspot, and we'll just quickly talk through the inspector panel for them. Who owns this particular hotspot? You probably don't, sorry. Which node owns this hotspot? You probably wouldn't want to change that, things might well break. What's the target of this hotspot? You probably could change that fairly safely in case you wanted to sort of retarget your hotspot. And do you want to override the runtime prefab used in terms for this hotspot? So that's an outgoing hotspot change, whereas when you are selecting a node and overriding a hotspot, that's an incoming hotspot change. So I'm saying the front door to corridor node specifically is overridden here, whereas if I come in and just select front door and click override, that's all nodes coming into front door that will change to that particular hotspot prefab. Now, in most cases, you're not going to need to want to do that, but in some people's cases, they're doing quite specific tours, so it might be useful. The map position written here is simply updated by the mapping panel, but you could update it manually, get those values from somewhere else, do it programmatically. There's also the use timeline, whether or not this particular node is interested in being involved in the timeline. Now, if I come in to front door, tick the duration milliseconds up to, let's say, 5,000, which is 5 seconds, and view the timeline. Because this particular hotspot is ticked as a timed element, it has an entry and an exit time, and I can use the timeline to modify when this hotspot will or will not be active. That's kind of useful, mostly on videos, but also for things that are a bit different, and that will actually apply not just to hotspots, but also to prefabs. Speaking of prefabs, the way that you create a prefab, much like you created a hotspot by coming up to this menu item, is you go to the one on the right, the prefab icon, and it will say to you, okay, which prefab are you interested in placing into this node? I'm going to come across and pick the static text and say, yep, we're going to put the static text on the mirror. Now, just like before, I can select this particular element and I can see in the inspector everything related to it. The prefab itself. Now, for a lot of people, they want to, for example, have lots of text prefabs all over their game, and each text prefab would need to say something different. Our suggestion is you use prefab instances and prefab variants to handle that. Just going to quickly talk through prefab variants for a moment, as I think a few people could benefit from a quick lesson on them. There's plenty of good resources online, but for C360's case, you would come in and find the example prefab that we've created for you that's pretty much what you need. Right click, create, and go to prefab variant. If I call it my text, what we've done is we've set up some nice prefab components that will allow you to customize what the prefab looks like from the very root, which can be quite useful. Now you see title, subtitle, and body in the case of text, and here you have a reference to TMP text for title, subtitle, and body. It's worth saying that anything beyond what's essentially given to you guys out of the box is just on you guys to create, but Unity's UI systems are absolutely brilliant and it's fairly straightforward to do it. If I come back out and I go to Virtual Tours R Us and I reopen my tour, I can then pick this prefab and say, yeah, it was text static, but actually my text, which is that prefab variant that I've just created, may be more appropriate for this particular part of the tour. Now you create as many prefabs as you need, map them again as needed. You do have the use timeline button, just like on the hotspots, and you can again edit either in here, this is done in milliseconds, so either in here or in the inspector. And I think by default prefabs will simply be active or not active in terms of a Unity term when the timeline is sort of inside or outside of their mapped range. Not everything needs it. You could untick use timeline and it would simply be there all the time. And the duration on an image could just be set to 0 if you have no interest in the timeline for your images. Another thing that's worth noting is whether you're using images or video nodes, in both cases you can come over onto the right hand side in the inspector when you have the node selected and see the load datas. Now we have two different types of load data for both images and video. In images they're texture and URL, and in video they are video clip and URL. And essentially the system will just fall through top to bottom until it finds the first one it's able to load. So if in this case I add a URL, and I'm just going to grab a random image from the internet and I paste it in there. If it were unable to load the main texture asset, it would then attempt to load the URL asset, which it has successfully done here. If I then wanted to come back in and pick a valid texture, it would revert back to that one because it is higher in the list. It is a texture, therefore it's got higher priority than a URL. But especially at runtime, you would certainly be able to override the behavior of which one it picked and when, just by looking at some of the reactor components, image reactor or video reactor. Speaking of video, again, we do have support for dragging and dropping in video clips, and that will work, and that will give you the thumbnail preview. Historically, we've had all sorts of problems needing to use FFmpeg to create our video thumbnails. Fortunately, Unity have come to their senses and have finally supported video player seeking and frame extraction in editor time. So we have a new system for loading our thumbnails. Hopefully people who've been having issues with that in the past will have that resolved. We have the exact same approach as on images in that we have clip load datas and URL load datas. If I grab a big buck bunny MP4 for testing, I should be able to come in, pick the one that suits me, say copy link address, and paste it into a URL load data. And what's going to happen here is that because the video clip is valid and Unity is able to load it, it will take precedence, but as soon as that video clip is unassigned, it will then revert back to my URL load, and in this case, give me Big Buck Bunny. I could add multiple URLs, however, the video player component doesn't currently support this because it doesn't really give us any feedback about when a URL is invalid. We may be adding some cool features to do our best to kind of work our way through that, but if you have a specific use case that requires multiple URLs, you may need to look at the Unity Video Reactor component and implement your very own validation. So I'm going to put that back to a video clip, and just like before, if I want to attach hotspots, I can do so. So just like in image clips, you do need to set a duration for your video clip. My one's about 7 seconds long, so we'll set it to 7,000 milliseconds. And then if I did have any mapped, for example, this hotspot that I wanted to map the timings on, I could have the hotspot only be visible at certain points in the video. That was a requested feature for quite a long time, so we added that a few versions ago. And once you have made your tour, we're going to move into the scene view. Right, when we have created our tour, we need to move into the scene. Now you can either create your own scene from scratch by bringing in the Complete 360 Tour prefab, or what we would recommend for anyone who wasn't already comfortable with creating tours in C360 is you open the Complete 360 Tour scene in the example tour folder. Definitely worth familiarizing yourself with a few of the objects in the scene hierarchy. Now we only actually have 2 essential ones and a base plate, which a lot of people tend to use. One of the most common questions that we actually get is, does C360 support a particular VR headset or a particular build target? I think those of you who have kind of been watching closely will identify that what C360 actually does in the meat of it is just to produce a very clever scriptable object that contains all the data that one would need to construct a tour. Once we're actually into runtime and dealing with what camera is looking at it, we're into the kind of realms of, well, C360 is providing an example of one implementation, but the reality is you could extend or change or swap bits out any way that you needed to, including to support your very own VR headsets. We test C360 on a few different headsets, but the reality is that they go out of date so quickly that it's very difficult to make a definitive statement on whether they're supported. Our response to the question of, does C360 support my particular VR headset, will always be the same thing. If you're able to open Unity and build it for your headset, even just a demo scene with a cube in it, if you're able to do that successfully, the odds are you will be able to use C360 with it, providing you follow some of the instructions I'm about to give. The first one is, take a little look at the camera base, camera and crosshair objects. If we go from bottom to top, the crosshair object is simply our implementation of a particular way that you might want to do a crosshair. Now we have a few different nice things in there, like they show how much a hotspot is loading, but the reality is you could delete that object and not a lot would really happen. You just wouldn't have a crosshair. Next on up, you have the camera. Now the camera does have one very important component on it, which is the fade post process, and that's used to dip the camera down to black, swap the media out, and bring it back up from black. Now you could remove the fade if you were going to do some other type of transition, but C360 currently only supports one piece of media being loaded at a time, so dipping through black seems like the most sensible way to do it. Then we have a few components which are essentially optional. Mouse look, swipe look, and gyro look are all examples of implementations of how you might want to control the camera. If you're using a VR headset, the odds are you don't want any of these. Mouse look is very useful for PC, swipe look for mobile, and gyro look if you're doing a kind of old school Google Cardboard style VR headset. But as always, you don't need to use any of them. You could turn them off. You could also remove them safely. Then we have 2 input raycasters. We have the gaze input raycaster and the mouse input raycaster. These essentially fire rays out into the scene and attempt to interact with your prefabs and with your hotspots. Now the gaze input raycaster just fires straight through the middle of the camera. It's obviously very useful if you haven't got controls for your XR device. And mouse input raycaster does it from the mouse. Very useful when you're doing something like a WebGL tool that doesn't have a variable camera. The components are fairly self-explanatory, and they come with a bunch of parameters that cover most of the use cases we find people need, but as with all things, you can strip them all out, you can add your own, you can do what you like with them, and the camera will largely work. Finally, we have the camera base component. Now this component, all it does is make sure that that entry your system works properly. It will rotate that transform accordingly in order to ensure that the camera is looking the correct way when the media switches. Now, if you're using a VR headset that doesn't inherit the transform from its parent, when its camera is deciding which way to look, then that system simply isn't going to work, and you're going to have to open up the camera base script and change the way it works to suit your specific headset. The next object that's worth looking at is the Complete 360 Tour object. Now this is really the meat of the thing. We have the Complete 360 Tour component. That is the main component that takes in a tour, takes in an entry node, and makes sure that a tour is running. We also have a transition right here. This could be replaced by one of your own transitions, although I'm not sure many people are actually doing that. this case, it's a fade transition. It will fade down to black, switch the media and fade back up, but it does need a reference to this camera fade post process component in order to be able to do that. So if you have set up your own camera, make sure you've added the fade post process or removed this fade transition and written your own. You have a time component that's just used to track kind of the duration of how far we are through a node. In the case of videos, it will be informed by the video player, and in the case of images, it will depend on the media duration assigned in the tool when you first made it. But all of the different prefabs and hotspots that are interested in whether or not they should be active will be asking that time component whether or not they're sort of within the appropriate time range. And we have a keep screen awake. That's just a little helper one because a lot of people are working on mobile and the screen does tend to turn off. But it's certainly not necessary. Next thing, you have the media view object that has a few different components. The media surface, simply used to assign different textures and power the shaders that are running on this currently black sphere. And it just exposes some nice methods like Y flipping, stereoscopic, and actually setting the appropriate texture. Then you have three different reactors. The first one is an image reactor. Its job is to listen for when media is swapping to an image, and if it is, it will set the texture of the media surface to be the texture from that node. The entry yaw reactor, that again waits for a media switch and tells the camera base that it should rotate in a particular way. And the Unity video reactor. Now that is a Unity video player based video reactor that again goes through that video node's load datas and informs a Unity video player component what it needs to do, what the URL is, or what the video clip is. People who are experiencing issues with the video player, Unity's video player is actually very good these days, but it isn't necessarily the most performant one on the market. AV Pro is one that we've certainly used in the past. If you did use an alternative video player, that would be completely fine. You'd simply need to rewrite the video reactor component or write your own video reactor component. But by opening it up, if you've got a bit of C# skill, you shouldn't have any difficulty doing that. And the final two reactors, we have the hotspot reactor that is responsible for generating the hotspots when a piece of media switches, and the prefab reactor, which is responsible for generating the prefab when the media switches. Hotspots will be spawned under the hotspot reactor, prefabs will be spawned under the prefab reactor. You have access to all of the scripts you're seeing here. You can open them up, see how they work, edit them, make them suit your purposes. And then finally, we just include a simple little base plate prefab that's got some nice settings on it that some people might want to use. We find that base plates that are embedded into videos often suffer from the fact that an equirectangular projection has quite a lot of distortion when you reach the north and south pole, whereas doing an in-engine base plate, obviously you're going to get completely perfect visuals and a nice sharp line around the circle. So delete it if you don't want it, but we've certainly found people quite like it. When it finally comes to building your tour, the build process is exactly like any other Unity project. You simply go to File, Build Settings, make sure that let's get the build settings up, make sure that your player settings are configured appropriately for your project, and then go through and build. Now, anyone with a kind of specific build question, how do I build for this platform? How do I build for this device? The likelihood is that that question is actually nothing to do with C360, and you're going to find a lot more useful resources online than you are by emailing us. We quite often get people saying, how do I build for iOS? You know, how do we do the Xcode side of things? And the problem is we aren't experts at all of those things. We've made a cool tool. It runs through Unity. Unity is responsible for a lot of these questions. So go out there, find the great resources online. They should be able to help. However, for anything specific to C360, please feel free to reach out. The kind of global email that everyone can access is hello@digitalsalmon.co.uk. You're welcome to send an email there. However, we do have a Discord, which is probably a bit more active, and you're more likely to get hold of me or one of the other devs quite a bit quicker. So if you jump into the Discord, there is a tech support channel. The link for that will be below this video and also on the store page when the next update goes live. Okay, I think we've covered everything. Happy touring.